What if I told you that a resident carrying like a makeshift weapon in the hallway or screaming at the top of their lungs at 3 in the morning isn't necessarily a sign that they're failing at being housed?
Right, it sounds totally backward.
It really does. I mean, what if instead that behavior is actually a sign that their brain is executing this highly evolved, perfectly logical survival strategy?
Yeah, it sounds completely counterintuitive when you first hear it. Because, our immediate instinct is to just label that behavior as dangerous or non-compliant or just plain chaotic.
Absolutely.
But when you actually look closer, you start to realize it's a profound misinterpretation of how the human brain adapts to really extreme environments.
And that misinterpretation is exactly what we are tearing apart today. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a document that is fundamentally turning everything we know about homelessness, trauma, and recovery completely upside down.
It really is a massive paradigm shift.
We're looking at a 50-plus page manual. It's titled The Comprehensive Well-Being and Stability Assessment.
And what makes this document so uniquely powerful is honestly its origin. Like, it's not some dry clinical manual drafted in an ivory tower by people who have never been on the streets.
Right.
It was authored by Celeste Aurora Martin,
Mm.
and she is a formerly homeless veteran, a transgender woman, and currently works as a mental health peer support specialist.
Yeah, the text notes, she actually arrived at USVETS back in 2015 as a homeless veteran herself.
Wow.
She completed the program. She moved into permanent supportive housing at Cloudbreak Communities down in Houston. And then she completely immersed herself in that community. I mean, by 2022, she was the president of the Residents Council.
Which is incredible.
And then by 2024, she was working as a mental health peer in the Veterans Advocate Services and Training Program.
So she has literally lived on both sides of the clipboard.
Exactly.
She has the actual lived experience of navigating the exact systems she's now trying to reform. And, that lived experience is basically the pulse of this entire 50-page assessment.
We also have this fascinating stack of supporting evidence right alongside her assessment. So we've got actual certificates of recognition from the American Red Cross, the City of Houston, and the United States Congress honoring her work.
Yeah, that's quite the resume.
We have a peer-reviewed chat transcript that analyzes the psychological framework she built. And perhaps most importantly, we are going to look at some concrete, jaw-dropping data reports.
The data is where it gets really real.
I mean, we're talking about massive, verified crime reductions at specific housing properties where this exact method was implemented.
It is exceptionally rare to see a source stack that seamlessly connects highly theoretical psychological frameworks straight down to literal block-by-block crime statistics.
Oh.
Like, you just don't see that often.
So our mission today is to essentially deconstruct this groundbreaking assessment to truly understand a philosophy called the Housing First model. We need to figure out how this model handles complex trauma, the incredibly delicate tightrope walk of medical confidentiality, and really why traditional methods of helping the unhoused so often end in just a revolving door of failure.
And we're going to trace the specific mechanisms of why building up community resilience is statistically more effective than forcing rigid clinical compliance.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the foundation of Martin's philosophy, Housing First, because this term gets thrown around in the media all the time and usually incorrectly.
Oh, constantly.
From my understanding of the traditional models, what we often call transitional housing, housing is basically treated as a prize. The system says, okay, you go to rehab, you attend all your mandatory group therapy sessions, you pee in a cup to prove you're sober.
Right, jump through all the hoops.
Exactly, and if you jump through all those hoops to prove you are quote-unquote ready, then you earn the keys to an apartment.
Yeah, exactly. The transitional model demands behavioral compliance as the entry ticket.
Right.
It operates on this deep-seated assumption that a person must completely resolve their behavioral health issues or their substance use disorders before they can handle the basic responsibility of a lease.
Which, if you think about it, is kind of wild. I mean, it's like telling someone with a broken leg that they need to win a marathon before you'll give them a pair of crutches.
That's a great way to put it.
Housing First just flips that entire script. As Martin describes it in the text, Housing First treats stable housing as a foundational baseline for recovery. It is absolutely not a reward for treatment compliance. It's the prerequisite for treatment to even begin.
Because you simply cannot expect someone to achieve higher-level self-actualization or maintain perfect medication adherence if they are actively freezing in a tent
Yeah, or starving.
or constantly looking over their shoulder to avoid being assaulted. I mean, the assessment makes it incredibly clear that establishing baseline stability, which means physical safety, a locking door, and simple dignity, that must come before you can tackle complex psychiatric needs.
No, I hear what you're saying about housing first. And philosophically, I mean, it sounds incredibly compassionate.
Ditto.
But my immediate fear, like if I'm a landlord or even just as a neighbor in that building, would be that by handing over keys without requiring treatment first, I'm just subsidizing a drug den.
Right.
I mean, aren't I inviting chaos into a residential building? Doesn't this approach just kind of enable destructive behavior?
It is the most common and frankly valid concern people have. It really is.
Yeah.
But the text addresses this directly. The reality is the chaos is already there. It's just happening on the street, where it's frankly deadlier and way more expensive for the city to manage.
That's a really good point.
Housing First doesn't invite chaos indoors. It brings the person out of a perpetually chaotic environment so that interventions actually stand a chance of working.
And this brings us to how the assessment itself is actually conducted. The peer review chat transcript in our sources points out a massive difference in the initial encounter between a resident and a staff member.
Yeah, the intake process.
Because in traditional transitional housing, the intake process often feels like an interrogation. You sit in a sterile office, and a caseworker with a clipboard just fires off these deeply personal questions about your deepest trauma, your criminal record, your psychiatric deficits.
It focuses entirely on what is broken within the individual.
Right.
But Martin's tool changes the very title of the worker. They aren't a caseworker or an interrogator. They're called a stability partner.
I really love that phrasing, stability partner.
It changes the entire power dynamic. The chat transcript notes that this assessment operationalizes trauma-informed care.
Operationalizes it.
Yeah, because we hear that phrase, trauma-informed care, as a buzzword all the time. But here, it actually has a mechanical function. It means shifting the dynamic from doing something to a participant to working alongside them.
Well, okay, so it's collaborative.
Exactly. The text explicitly instructs the stability partner that they are not there to diagnose, score, judge, or punish. They're there to identify practical barriers in the person's environment.
Okay, so if we're changing the paradigm from like fixing the broken individual to evaluating the environment, we have to look at the psychological theory grounding all of this.
Which is fascinating.
The text says it's built on the ecological approach. Specifically, it mentions Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory and the World Health Organization's social determinants of health.
Yes.
Now, I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. Bronfenbrenner's model is the one with the concentric circles, right? Like a bullseye.
That's the one. Imagine a bullseye.
Mm-hmm.
At the very center is the individual, so their biology, their internal psychology. The next circle out is their immediate environment, their apartment, their family, their direct neighbors.
Right.
The next circle out encompasses their interactions with larger systems, so local government, the healthcare system, the job market. And then the outermost circle is the broad cultural and economic realities of the time.
So instead of just staring at the bullseye, you know, the person's individual brain chemistry, the person in environment framework forces the stability partner to look at all those surrounding circles. Because stability isn't just a personality trait.
Exactly. You cannot assess the health of a fish without examining the water it's swimming in.
Oh, that's good.
Is the water toxic? Is the current too fast? If you just look at the fish and say, wow, you're swimming really erratically, you must have a behavioral problem, you are completely missing the fact that a predator just dropped into the tank.
And to practically examine that water, the assessment utilizes something called the ABC model of applied behavior analysis: antecedents, behaviors, and consequences.
Yes. This is a critical tool for the stability partner. Let's walk through how this completely changes the response to a crisis.
Okay, so looking at this ABC model, if I'm interpreting the text correctly, the antecedent is basically the trigger in the environment.
Right.
It makes me think of like a dog barking wildly at the front window. The behavior is the barking. But if you just yell at the dog for being bad or aggressive, you aren't solving anything. The antecedent is the mailman walking up to the door.
Exactly.
Once the mailman leaves, the dog calms down.
That is a brilliant analogy. Now apply that to a housing resident. Let's say a resident is missing all their medical appointments, refusing to leave their room, and yelling aggressively at any staff member who knocks on their door.
Okay.
In a traditional model, the label is immediately applied. This person is noncompliant, unmotivated, or aggressive. The consequence? A written warning, a lease violation, and eventually eviction.
So the dog gets sent to the pound because no one looked out the window to see the mailman.
Precisely. The ABC model forces the stability partner to stop and look out the window. Look at the behavior, yelling and withdrawal. Now, search the surrounding circles of their environment for the antecedent.
What happened right before the behavior started?
Exactly. Did they receive an unpaid rent notice that they literally can't read? Are there bed bugs in their mattress disrupting their sleep for the last 4 nights?
Wow.
Could a domestic dispute down the hall trigger a PTSD flashback?
The text actually refers to ignoring these antecedents as the start of a cascading failure.
Yes.
I kept visualizing this as a mechanical failure, like a flat tire on your car. If you get a flat tire, you are late for work. Because you are late, your boss fires you. Because you lose your job, you can't pay your rent. Because you can't pay rent, you get evicted.
Right.
Looking back, the eviction wasn't some profound moral failure or a psychiatric defect. It was just a flat tire that never got patched.
And that cascade happens incredibly fast for someone living on the margins. I mean, remarkably fast. So how does Martin's 50-page assessment actually catch the flat tire before the cascade begins?
That is
It does so by systematically screening for incredibly mundane, practical barriers long before it ever asks about deep psychological trauma.
This part of the text really grounded it for me. It looks for logistical hurdles. If you're listening right now, imagine trying to navigate your entire week if you suddenly didn't have your driver's license, your birth certificate, or your social security card.
It's nearly impossible.
The assessment actively looks for missing IDs. Because without those, you can't apply for a job. You can't get on the wait list for subsidized food.
It screens for digital access, too. Does the resident have a reliable phone? Do they have an email address they can actually log into?
Right.
It screens for environmental hazards inside the unit itself. Are there pests? Is there black mold? Does the lock on their door actually engage securely?
It also checks for legal barriers, active warrants, eviction records, property debt.
And by focusing on these environmental and structural antecedents first, the stability partner lifts the crushing burden of fixing everything off the individual's shoulders.
That makes so much sense.
They aren't walking in and saying, "Why are you so severely depressed and unmotivated?" They're saying, "I notice your window latch is broken, making you feel unsafe, and you have an unresolved court date hanging over your head. Let's fix the latch today, and I'll call legal aid about the court date tomorrow. Then let's see how your anxiety levels look next week."
But, looking at these environmental triggers inevitably brings us to the most profound antecedent of all for the unhoused, the trauma of the street itself.
Yes, absolutely.
Because if you've lived outside for years, your immediate environment was essentially a war zone. And the text poses this really uncomfortable reality. The survival mechanisms that kept you alive on the street do not translate well into an apartment building.
This is the intersection of complex PTSD and homelessness. When you are living on the street, your brain and body physically adapt to a constant, unrelenting state of threat. You develop intense hypervigilance. The assessment emphasizes a trauma-informed response, which means we have to assume that erratic or difficult behavior inside an apartment is often a highly evolved adaptation that successfully kept that person alive outside.
It's like taking a high-performance race car engine and dropping it into a golf cart.
Oh, wow, yes.
The raw power and the heightened revving were absolutely necessary to survive the racetrack. But when you put that engine into a quiet suburban golf cart, the sheer force of it just tears the cart apart.
That is exactly what happens. To understand the race car engine, the assessment explicitly screens for a resident's previous exposure to specific community safety events. Have they been repeatedly exposed to gunshots, overt physical violence, harassment from pedestrians, severe noise disturbances? Because if you have been living in a public park, sleeping at night is incredibly dangerous. You are vulnerable to being assaulted, robbed, or set on fire.
So a perfectly logical survival strategy is to just stay awake all night. You pace the perimeter, you keep watch, and you wait until the sun comes up to sleep. Because during the day, there are crowds and witnesses, which offers like a tiny bit of safety.
Right. Now take that person, hand them the keys to a Housing First apartment, and close the door. Their brain is still wired for the racetrack.
They stay awake all night.
Yes. Maybe they pace heavily on the floorboards, or they play the television at maximum volume to help them stay alert. Then they sleep all day. What is the immediate consequence?
Well, noise complaints from the neighbors below them. Then they sleep through their daytime case management appointments. The landlord gets frustrated and issues a formal lease violation.
And there's the start of your cascading failure. The very behavior that kept them alive on the street is now actively causing them to lose their housing indoors.
The text actually has this incredibly nuanced warning about how we interpret a resident calming down. It calls it symptom masking versus true root cause healing.
This is a huge point.
It warns the stability partner that if a resident who was previously pacing and yelling suddenly goes completely silent, they might not be cured. They might just be terrified of being evicted, so they're masking the symptoms.
Or worse, the absolute quiet might be an emotional shutdown.
Like completely zoning out.
Yeah, it could be a catatonia-like immobility where they're completely dissociating from reality. The system might look at a quiet resident and just check a box saying success, when in reality the resident is in profound psychological distress.
There is another detail in the text about survival behaviors that I found totally fascinating. It talks about informal community roles.
Oh, yes.
It notes that a resident might suddenly take on the persona of a community watch or a security guard. They might carry makeshift props like a heavy flashlight or a stick. They might dress in military-style surplus gear, heavily monitor who comes in and out of the lobby, and try to enforce arbitrary rules on the other residents.
In a traditional transitional housing setting, a property manager would immediately write that up as defiance, intimidation, or a nuisance.
Right. But the text advises the stability partner to view this through the trauma lens. It isn't merely defiance, it's a desperate attempt to manufacture control, safety, and a sense of purpose in a really unpredictable environment.
It is a brilliant psychological observation. But, as you pointed out earlier with your landlord concern, it introduces a very real tension. The text does not shy away from the reality of shared living.
Right, because let's be real here. If a resident is carrying a heavy stick in the hallway or blasting the TV at 3 a.m. because of their trauma, the property manager still has a physical building to run.
They do.
The other residents in that building, many of whom are also battling their own severe PTSD, they have a fundamental right to peace, quiet, and safety.
Absolutely.
So how does this assessment balance trauma-informed empathy with the cold, hard fact that you can't have someone terrorizing the hallway? Does trauma just become a blank check to excuse disruptive behavior?
That is the ultimate tension in supportive housing. And Martin's text tackles this through the concept of environmental suffering. The assessment acknowledges that suffering is never contained to just one individual.
Okay, how so?
If one neighbor is up all night screaming in crisis, the surrounding neighbors experience the consequences. They lose sleep, they feel fear, their own trauma is triggered, and the trust in the building's safety just evaporates.
So the goal isn't to just shrug and say, well, let them yell, they have trauma, we must be empathetic.
Absolutely not. The goal is to use restorative safety and early de-escalation strategies to intervene long before the behavior escalates to the point of forcing an eviction.
Intercept the antecedent.
Yes, you don't excuse the behavior, you intercept the antecedent. You recognize the trauma so you can de-escalate the yelling effectively in the moment rather than just slipping a written warning under their door, a warning they might not even have the literacy skills to read.
Okay, so how do they actually intercept it? I mean, if the stability partner is just one person, they can't be patching flat tires, fixing broken locks, managing 3 a.m. PTSD flashbacks, and acting as a therapist all at once.
No, that's a recipe for burnout.
The text relies heavily on a specific team structure to manage this, which it calls the continuum of care.
Yes, the continuum of care is the backbone of this ecosystem.
Yeah.
It means that the stability partner is not a lone wolf. They are never expected to solve every problem.
Right.
Their job is to conduct the assessment, identify the practical barriers, and then act as a dispatcher. They connect the participant to a massive, networked web of specialized services, medical care, legal aid, food banks, psychiatric support.
And deeply embedded within this continuum of care is a philosophy that can be highly controversial, harm reduction.
It is controversial mostly because it's widely misunderstood.
Right. I think a lot of people hear harm reduction and assume it means the staff is just like handing out drugs and completely giving up on the idea of sobriety.
Yeah, that's the common myth.
So what does harm reduction actually mean in the context of Martin's text?
Harm reduction is the pragmatic acknowledgement that demanding perfect, unbroken abstinence as a condition for receiving a roof over your head usually just leaves the most vulnerable people dying on the street.
Wow.
It does not mean giving up on sobriety. It simply means focusing on reducing the immediate, fatal consequences of a behavior today so the person is actually alive tomorrow to try again.
And the most concrete example of this in the sources is the emphasis on medication-assisted treatment.
Yes, often referred to as MAT. This involves using FDA-approved medications like buprenorphine or methadone, combined with counseling, to treat severe substance use disorders. particularly opioid dependence.
So it treats the physical
It
symptoms.
stops the physical cravings and the excruciating withdrawal symptoms, yes.
But the text specifically highlights mobile MAT. And if we think back to the logistical barriers we discussed earlier, this makes perfect sense. Imagine a resident who has severe social anxiety, zero access to a car, no bus fare, and is waking up in the terrifying physical grip of opioid withdrawal.
It's awful.
If the system tells them, hey, your treatment is approved, just take 3 different city buses across town to the clinic by 8:00 a.m., that is a guaranteed failure. You are setting them up to fail.
You are asking someone with a broken leg to climb a mountain. Mobile M completely removes the mountain. A specialized medical van, staffed with nurses and counselors, physically drives into the parking lot of the apartment complex.
Oh, that changes everything.
They bring the clinic directly to the resident's front door. They administer the medication right there. That completely intercepts the cascading failure.
The text is incredibly pragmatic about when to deploy these resources too. It outlines a triage protocol. It specifically dictates that if a stability partner sits down to do this 50-page assessment and they realize the resident hasn't eaten in 2 days, or is actively at risk of a fatal overdose, or is facing immediate physical violence, the assessment stops.
You don't keep asking questions.
You physically close the binder. You don't ask them about their childhood or their 10-year career goals if they are starving today. You trigger the crisis pathways immediately.
It prioritizes biological survival over bureaucratic paperwork. But, coordinating all these different moving parts, the mobile nurses, the legal aid workers, the housing managers, the peer supports, it brings up a massive ethical and practical hurdle.
Confidentiality.
Yes.
Confidentiality.
If you have a team of 5 different professionals trying to stabilize one person's life, how do they communicate without completely violating the resident's privacy?
It's a huge challenge.
It reminds me of the need-to-know principle in a spy movie. The intelligence agent only gets the specific details required to execute their piece of the mission. They don't get the whole file. But when you apply that to social work, how does a team coordinate care without shattering the trust they just spent weeks building?
The spy movie analogy is spot on. The text enforces a rigid, non-negotiable policy of minimum necessary information sharing. The stability partner cannot probe into a person's sexual trauma, their legal history, or their specific psychiatric diagnoses without explicit documented permission.
And when it comes to how the team shares what little info they have, the text breaks down 4 different models of care: unidisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary.
Yes.
I'm not going to lie, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary sounded completely identical to me on my first read.
They do sound similar, but the distinction is the difference between a functional team and a massive privacy violation. Let's break them down. In a unidisciplinary model, one single person tries to do everything.
Right.
The privacy risk is low, but the risk of burnout and missing critical medical issues is sky high.
Right, the lone wolf approach.
Exactly. In a multidisciplinary model, you have different experts, a doctor, a lawyer, a housing manager, but they work in total silos. They never talk to each other. The resident has to repeat their traumatic story 5 different times to 5 different people.
Which is exhausting and incredibly re-traumatizing.
Exactly. So the assessment advocates for the interdisciplinary model. Here, the team meets, they coordinate, and they build a shared unified plan for the resident. But, and this is crucial, they maintain their distinct professional boundaries.
Okay, so how does that differ from transdisciplinary?
In a transdisciplinary model, the professional roles blur completely. Everyone cross-trains and shares everything. It sounds wonderfully collaborative in theory, but the text issues a stern warning against it. Let me give you a concrete scenario.
Okay.
Let's say a resident needs to be moved from a 3rd-floor apartment to a ground-floor apartment. The medical nurse knows this is because the resident suffered a severe sexual assault in a stairwell and now has paralyzing panic attacks when climbing stairs.
Oh, I see where this is going.
In a transdisciplinary model, the nurse might share that entire horrific backstory with the property manager to get the transfer approved. But the property manager who just handles rent checks and maintenance has absolutely no professional need to know the intimate details of that resident's sexual assault.
The text has this incredibly sharp line about this. It states that teams must never share sensitive details just because they're interesting, emotional, compelling, or convenient.
Never.
The property manager just needs the medical note saying, resident requires a ground floor accommodation due to a documented medical mobility/anxiety issue. That's it. Minimum necessary information.
Because protecting dignity and privacy is step 1. If a resident walks into the lobby and realizes the maintenance guy knows about their childhood trauma, the trust is instantly annihilated. The resident withdraws, the hypervigilance returns, and the entire ecosystem collapses.
But if you successfully protect that privacy, you get to step two.
Right.
And this is where Martin's model evolves from just being a solid clinical tool into something that is genuinely revolutionary. It takes residents who have been stabilized and actively empowers them to become the support system for each other.
It flips the entire script. For years, these individuals have been treated as passive patients, or worse, as burdens on society. This model treats them as active, vital community members.
This brings us to the concept of reciprocal altruism. The assessment literally asks the participant, what protective strengths do you have? How might you want to help others in this building?
So empowering.
Do they want to offer peer listening? Do they want to help distribute food from the pantry? Do they want to do safety walks around the courtyard?
Instead of a top-down, paternalistic approach where the staff dictates every rule and solves every minor squabble, they are engineering a self-sustaining ecosystem. Residents are encouraged to check on each other.
And we have hard proof in the sources that this isn't just a nice thought experiment. We have a certificate here from the American Red Cross. It's dated January 23, 2025, and it was awarded to Celeste Martin for adult and infant CPR and automated external defibrillator training.
Right.
The text mentions that they actually coordinate this exact type of life-saving training, CPR, wound care, and Narcan administration for overdoses for the community members themselves.
Think about the profound psychological impact of that. You are taking individuals whose society has completely discarded, and you are training them to be first responders in their own hallways.
That's huge.
You are entrusting them with life-saving skills. That builds an immense reservoir of self-esteem and creates a culture where residents are looking out for each other long before staff needs to intervene.
The text also outlines structured supports like community-funded work programs for older adults. So instead of just sitting in their rooms, residents might get paid by a grant program to do groundskeeping, clean up the common areas, or act as peer outreach workers.
Which beautifully addresses those environmental antecedents we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Because if a resident owes $500 in back rent or property debt, that financial anxiety is a massive trigger for trauma behaviors. By giving them paid work within the community, they earn the money to pay off the debt.
You eliminate the antecedent.
You prevent the eviction, and you give them a profound sense of purpose. They are literally pulling weeds to keep their housing and taking pride in how the courtyard looks.
And crucially, the assessment allows the participants to define their own version of progress. Success is no longer measured by an arbitrary institutional metric like, attended 4 mandatory group therapy sessions this month.
Right.
Success is defined in the participant's own words.
Right.
For one person, success might be getting a full-time job. For someone with severe agoraphobia and complex PTSD, success might simply be leaving their room twice a week to water the community garden. Both are completely valid.
But I'm going to play devil's advocate again here because the stakes are so high. I love the idea of neighbors helping neighbors. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But aren't we asking people who are already struggling with severe trauma, hypervigilance, and fragile sobriety to take on the heavy burden of saving each other? Isn't it incredibly dangerous to have someone who just recovered from a crisis trying to manage a neighbor who is actively escalating?
Martin clearly anticipated that exact critique because the assessment has robust safety valves built right into the architecture. It explicitly asks the participant if helping others is causing them to feel overwhelmed or if it's threatening their own stability.
Okay, so it checks in.
It emphasizes over and over that participation in mutual aid must be strictly bounded, entirely voluntary, and physically safe.
Right. They aren't asking residents to be amateur SWAT teams or psychiatric nurses. If a neighbor is having a severe, violent psychiatric break, you don't send the guy down the hall who just got his CPR certificate.
No, you trigger the professional continuum of care.
The mutual aid is designed for the everyday stressors, the flat tires. It's about borrowing a cup of sugar, helping an elderly neighbor carry heavy groceries up the stairs, or just knocking on a door to remind someone that the mobile mat van is in the parking lot.
It weaves a fabric of mutual respect. When people feel genuinely invested in their environment, when they helped plant a garden, when they know the name of the guy living next door, they're significantly less likely to punch a hole in the hallway drywall when they get angry.
That makes a lot of sense.
They're less likely to get into a screaming match over a noise complaint because that's not just a faceless neighbor anymore. That's the guy who helped them carry the laundry last week.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of this deep dive. Everything we have discussed, the Bronfenbrenner ecology, the ABC model, intercepting the flat tires, mobile mat, minimum necessary privacy, and reciprocal altruism. It all sounds incredible in theory.
It does.
It is deeply empowering and trauma-informed. But if you are listening to this, you are probably waiting for the catch. Does this actually work in the unforgiving real world? When you take individuals with severe complex PTSD, heavy legal barriers, and extreme poverty, and you put them into an apartment complex using this peer-led ecological approach, what actually happens to the neighborhood?
Let's look at the hard numbers. The data provided in our source stack is nothing short of staggering.
It really is.
We have the internal crime statistics for 2 specific housing properties, comparing a snapshot from January 1st to May 12th in 2024 versus that exact same window in 2025 after these community building methods were heavily implemented.
Okay, let's start with the property at 4640 Main Street. In that nearly 5-month window in 2024, there were 43 total criminal offenses recorded. In 2025, that number dropped to 29. That is a 33% reduction in overall crime in just 1 year.
And when you look at the specific categories, it's even more revealing. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon went from 2 incidents down to 0. A complete 100% reduction.
Wow.
Burglary of a habitation dropped. Incidents of terroristic threats dropped by a massive 71%.
But the numbers at the second property, 4500 Travis, are where my jaw actually dropped. Total offenses went from 35 in 2024 down to just 10 in 2025. That is a 71% reduction in total crime across the board.
And within that 71% drop, what specific data point stands out the most to you?
The mental health investigations. In 2024, there were 6 incidents severe enough that the police had to be dispatched to investigate a mental health crisis. In 2025, that number dropped to 2. That is a 67% reduction in armed police officers being called to handle psychiatric emergencies.
This is where we connect the data back to the theory. Why did crime drop 71% at the Travis location? We know it's not because they brought in a zero-tolerance policy and aggressively evicted everyone, because that just pushes the crime back out onto the street.
Right.
The crime dropped because the mechanisms we discussed were firing on all cylinders.
Right. Let's trace the mechanism. In 2024, let's say a resident's air conditioning breaks during a Houston heat wave. The heat is the antecedent. They can't sleep. Their trauma hypervigilance spikes.
The race car engine starts revving.
Yes. They start pacing the courtyard at 3 a.m., carrying a stick for protection. A neighbor yells at them from a window. The resident screams back and threatens the neighbor. The police are called for a mental health investigation and a terroristic threat. That's how you get those 2024 numbers.
Exactly. Now play that same scenario in 2025 under Martin's model. The AC breaks. The stability partner, using the ABC model, recognizes the heat as a critical environmental antecedent before the sun even sets.
Okay.
They use minimum necessary information to get maintenance to provide a portable fan immediately. A peer support neighbor, who knows a resident through the community garden, checks in on them at 10 p.m. The resident feels seen and relatively safe. They sleep. The conflict never happens. The police are never called.
The cascading failure is intercepted. The flat tire is changed while the car is still in the driveway.
The data empirically proves that the psychological theory works on the pavement. And the broader city infrastructure noticed the shift. Our sources include a certificate of appreciation from the City of Houston, signed by Dr. LaShondra Jones from the Office of Veterans and Military Affairs, dated February 24, 2026.
And what does it say?
It specifically honors Cloudbreak communities for supporting veterans through innovative programming, structured engagement, and community empowerment, explicitly noting that these efforts contributed to a remarkable reduction in crime.
We also have that certificate of congressional recognition from Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, honoring Celeste Martin for her work as a mentor. And it's not just isolated to Houston, right? The text cites major macro-level studies that replicate these micro-level results, like the Denver Supportive Housing Social Impact Bond Initiative and Canada's massive at-home/Chessoy project. They all point to the exact same conclusion.
When you synthesize all this material, the 50-page assessment, the local crime drops, the federal recognition, the international studies, it tells an undeniable story.
It really does.
This peer-led Housing First model isn't just a compassionate, bleeding heart philosophy. It is a highly verifiable, mathematically proven engine for reducing public crime, saving taxpayer money on emergency services, and restoring fundamental human dignity.
So we've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with Celeste Martin, a formerly homeless veteran who took her lived experience and forged it into a revolutionary assessment tool. We learned the critical difference between transitional housing, which demands you heal before you are housed, and the housing first model, which recognizes that a locked door and a safe bed are the absolute prerequisites for healing.
We unpacked Bronfenbrenner's concentric circles and the ABC model, realizing that behaviors we label as aggressive or crazy are often just logical reactions to environmental antecedents,
Yeah.
barking at the mailman.
Right.
We explored how the hypervigilant survival strategies of the street, the race car engine,
Hmm.
will tear apart the golf cart of an indoor apartment if we don't apply trauma-informed de-escalation.
We saw how harm reduction keeps people alive, how Mobile Map brings the clinic to the living room, and how strict minimum necessary information sharing builds an unbreakable trust within a continuum of care team.
And ultimately, we saw how reciprocal altruism, giving residents life-saving CPR training, paying them to beautify their own community, and giving them a voice in their own recovery, creates a web of community resilience so strong that it resulted in a 71% drop in local crime.
It's amazing.
It proves that stability is not something you demand from a person. It is something you build with them.
But before we wrap up, I want to bring this right to you, the person listening to this. You are likely not navigating the trauma of street homelessness right now. You might be sitting in a climate-controlled room or driving a reliable car to a stable job. But think about your own ecosystem.
Get your own circles.
Think about the last time you experienced a cascading failure in your own life. Maybe you missed a crucial deadline, which led to a fight with your partner, which led to a string of terrible dietary habits for a week. How often do you look at that cascade and label it as a deep, personal character flaw?
A lot of us do.
How often do you beat yourself up, demanding perfection from yourself, before you allow yourself to feel worthy of stability? What if you gave yourself the grace to just recognize that you hit a flat tire?
And to take that reflection one step further out into your community, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The text we explored today emphasizes a profound, somewhat haunting idea that suffering is not only individual, it often emerges from shared environments.
Wow.
If that is true for trauma, violence, and instability, then the inverse must also be true for healing. Healing emerges from shared environments. So what small act of reciprocal altruism could you introduce into your own neighborhood or your workplace today? What is one minor environmental antecedent you could fix for a coworker or a neighbor that might silently intercept their cascading failure before it even has a chance to begin?
Because when we finally step back and look at the whole picture, we realize that the foundation of a healthy, stable life isn't about isolating the individual and demanding they fix themselves. It's about the strength of the ecosystem standing around them.